evening, everyone. It's an absolute honor and pleasure to be here for all the reasons that Nitin Gadkari ji already spelled out, and because Pavan, Shashi, both of them are absolutely towering intellects in a society when it is much needed, and dear friends of all of us. So it's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you for asking me, Pavan. A huge congratulations for this. Before I dive into this conversation, I just wanted to share one thought which makes me particularly proud to be here, is that at a time when across the world, countries and leaders and nations and civilizations are trying to reduce themselves into little thimble-sized ideas of who they are, essential identities, Pavan's book and his approach is actually to open a door, a tiny door into a vast ocean. So it's literally like a reverse action of identifying ourselves and defining ourselves by opening it up to an ocean of who we are. And it's really many oceans coming together in this book, and it's fascinating really to get that window into who we are. So with that, Pavan, I wanted to start with first the trigger for, as Nitin Gadkari ji said, this is a gargantuan exercise. So what was your trigger to even undertake it in the first place?
Thank you, Shoma, and I want to personally thank Nitin ji for not only his very kind words of appreciation, which matter to me, but also for, contrary to what he averred, his very deep thinking on a subject of importance, which essentially boils down to what is the link between culture, heritage, civilization, and our present, and what is the link between the past and the future in the making of the future. And so I always say, Nitin ji, that nations which are culturally rootless are unlikely to be authentic great powers. I often say that nobody respects photocopies. You have to be yourself without chauvinism or xenophobia. And for that you must know something about your culture. So that was the trigger. When I say trigger, I do not claim any special authority for me to write this book, but several of my recent books, my first book was a biography of Mirza Ghalib, and it began with a search, a desire to know more about somebody whom I consider to be one of the greatest poets the world has seen. And it proceeded then down a very wide range of books, which included Krishna, which included the middle class, which included being Indian, becoming Indian, which included a book on the Kama Sutra also, where people only saw the illustration and did not read my text. Then more recently, I began to develop a new respect for some of our philosophical foundations. And I do not restrict this to any particular religion. It is a word which Nitin ji used called moulik soch, the power of original thought, which you see from the Rig Veda to the Vedas, to the six systems of Hindu philosophy, through the Brahma Sutra, through the Bhagavad Gita, through the evolution of the most powerful of those six schools, the Advaita school, and again, beyond merely philosophy related to metaphysics, our ability to have the application of mind on social wisdoms. And all of this was imbued, in my view, Shashi, with an openness of mind. There was no fiat. There was no prescriptive direction. There was no prescribed ritual. There was not even a commandment for divinity. In fact, I often say the six systems of Hindu philosophy can technically be called atheist, because they are not talking about God. their search is for what could be the ultimate truth behind this plurality of the cosmos. So it was an openness of mind, and when Nitinji said that Udara Charitanam Vasudhaiva Kutumbak, the whole world is our family. I just end in 30 seconds. I'm reminded of television debates.
I was just grabbing the mic now.
Yeah, just to finish. As you enter Parliament, sir, you see right in the beginning it's written Udara Charitanam Vasudhaiva Kutumbak. And it was coined and written in the Rigveda at a time almost by new chronology scientifically tested. Some 6,000 years ago, when people were saying only my tribe, my home, my village, my little inhabitation is the truth, is the family that matters. And here we are saying the whole world is our family. So that openness, that interrogation, that questioning, that pushing the horizon, that invitation to ideation, that rumination, that marks the originality of Indian thought in its entire evolution. And my purpose in this book was to write a primer. My idea was to put between two ends a selection, which is subjective but fairly comprehensive, so that ordinary people who may not know, and many of you will probably know more than I do, who do not know, it ignites their curiosity to know, it acts as a reference book, and should they be so inclined to read more about something which reinforces their cultural roots.
Thank you, Pavan. Shashi, I want to bring you in here because Nitinji's already had his perspective on the book, that you have engaged very deeply with these questions yourself, and again at a time when there was deep polarization about the idea of being Hindu in the first place. You wrote a book about why I am a Hindu, and in some ways you shattered the sort of glass walls around you being a liberal by writing that. So one is that, as you have engaged with this idea of being Indian and Hindu, what are the sort of essential attributes you would pick from Pavan's book which illuminate that? And if you were not to pick the great ones that everyone already knows, would there be surprise choices in Pavan's book that you felt actually illuminates again this idea of what it means to be Indian?
Right. I mean, first of all, thank you, and let me congratulate Pavan for this excellent initiative in putting together so much within the covers of one book to 665 pages, I think is where it clocks in. So it's a substantial tome. Pavan and I have over the years, I think, had both the good fortune and the misfortune of ploughing much the same terrain when it comes to Hindu thought, philosophy, and civilization, because we both tend to agree that there is much to appreciate in the legacy we all have. One that is accepting of difference, one that is celebrating diversity, and one that acknowledges that there are multiple approaches to the truth, which is something that unfortunately some others who also lay claim to the same civilization legacy have preferred to avoid in focusing more narrowly. So having said that, I'm afraid because we tend to agree so much with each other, there's a lot here that I would simply applaud, a lot that I have read, sometimes in different translations, because Pavan's made his own selections. Some selections which perhaps, in some ways, I was pleasantly surprised by. And I, for example, did not know and had not read very much of the Brahma Sutra Badarayana, which is something that Pavan has found for us and given us a good summary of. On the other hand, the Tirukkural, which is one of the few southern texts, and that's one of my quarrels with Pavan, is, I feel, well represented but not adequately represented. They could have been much more. Now, if you look at the selection, let me make two quibbles because Pavan is a friend and he'll take it. The first is definitely that there is a bit of a confusion in the book. Because I think he begins with this wonderful idea of how do we appreciate our civilizational heritage through its own foundational text. And by doing that, he has a very, very good solution. But then he ventures, particularly in the 20th century, into terrain that has very little to do with civilization, philosophy, or ideas, but has much to do with political thought. And I think it would have been very useful to have had the political thought stuff as a companion volume. I mean, to be very honest, a speech by Indira Gandhi to the United Nations, or Vajpayee Saab speaking on the vote of confidence in Parliament, has very little to do with the weightier themes of this larger book. And so I think my first quarrel with Pavan is he could have perhaps left the political stuff out, had a companion volume. How does this civilization, this heritage represented in these foundational texts, then transmute itself into contemporary Indian political thought? The second problem I have, and it may sound parochial, but I think it's worth stressing, is that there is a distinctly North Indian bias to this selection. There's some startling omissions. I mean, when you look at some of the earlier philosophers, Basavanna is simply not there. Adi Shankara is not represented adequately at all. There are.
He's written a whole book on Adi Shankara. So I'll stand up in his defense.
This is why I'm surprised.
I will answer all.
And then when you come to the later philosophers, Vivekananda, whom I'm a great, I've been a Bhakta since my college days, but Sri Narayana Guru, one of the greatest thinkers of Hinduism, the greatest interpreters of the historical legacy of Hinduism, a man who did more perhaps to save Hinduism in Kerala than any other figure, completely absent, not even mentioned. Or for that matter, Basavanna. We haven't talked about some of the later thinkers and their contributions in the sort of, where you've got the more political selections, no Subramanian Bharati, no Kumaranathan. So these are some of the worries I have. I think we could really have, if you can have people I've enjoyed reading, Bhushan Kumar and Sahib Ludhianvi and so on, there are, I'm afraid, equally great poets in southern languages, whom perhaps you're not as familiar with. So I just think that perhaps 2 volumes, and maybe 3 volumes, and we can get all these volumes out. But let me just come back to your question. I think there's a lot here in the book that people will truly benefit from. First of all, the richness and diversity of the civilization heritage. It is unapologetically anchored in Hindu texts because a lot of our ancient civilization is from that tradition. But there is rightly a great deal from other thinkers. And when you look, for example, at the fact that you've got the Japji, that you've got Amir Khusrau, that you've got people like Mir Taqi has already been mentioned by Nitin Bhai, but if you look, for example, at the fact that Akbar's Din Ilahi, which people know about but don't really know much of, has a good 8 pages in the book. Those are all, I think, extremely welcome additions. And it gives us a chance to understand how some of this philosophical thought expanded and developed subsequently. I would say that if we were to represent some of the ways in which political thinking in 20th century India tried to build on our civilizational understandings and heritage, then, in all fairness, Deen Dayal Upadhyay should have been there. You don't have to agree with him, you don't have to agree with everybody or anybody in the book, but he is absent, and conversely, one could argue that there may be a good case for including or not including Holwalkar. I mean, Nitin Bhai mentioned bunch of thoughts in his remarks. But at least these are those who have come up with different interpretations, different ideas about the same civilization heritage that Pavan and I have a certain view on.
Right.
So perhaps we could have made room for that. But then again, that ventures into what might be seen as explicitly political territory. This is the challenge with the book. But I would urge you all to have this book on your shelves for one simple reason. It's something you'll always pick up and want to dip into at any time. There's a lot there that perhaps is not entirely familiar to everyone. The selection from the Kama Sutra, I'm afraid, is entirely untitillating, as, by the way, most of that book is. I'm sorry to say that, as Pavan said, people tend to look at the illustrations. It's very often dreary catalogues of lists. Vatsyayan is very fond of making lists. But there is a list here of the 63 skills and arts that a woman needs to know, which I think will get, which I think our feminists here will have their done boiling over. But some of them are quite fascinating when you realize how old the text is. And you realize that one of the skills is actually the description of the game we all know as Antakshari. Antakshari is supposed to be something that a woman in the Kama Sutra is supposed to know. So there you are.
Shashi, so I just, before I ask Pavan to get back on your, I just want to say that little bit before we, one get into the book, if we look at all that hasn't got done in the book, it's like saying this is a doorway into the ocean and now why isn't it a doorway to the sky? Because that literally is, how encompassing our traditions and our civilization is. But just to add to that, I would have asked Pavan, when you said about representation of the South, the representation of women is pretty much how it is 3 men on stage and 1 woman. So it is like that in the book as well. Of course, also Pavan feels all Indian thought stopped with Abul Kalam. I don't think anyone living is contributing to Indian thought. So I agree that there are many things to quibble with. But first I want to really look at what's already there. Pavan, I'm going to ask you to get back on what Shashi said, but I want to draw Nitinji into it as well. So Nitinji, you said that this in a way really illuminates what is the sort of fundamental attributes of this civilization. Not one religion, not any particular thought, but who we are as a evolving Indian identity. But in that, it's very interesting that yes, Pavan has not included any of the sort of big thinkers of the Hindutva movement as well.
He's got Savarkar.
Yes, but he's got him on caste.
Hindu reformist issues.
On caste, but not.
So
I would, because you're here, it would be interesting for you to articulate that what do you think when Sanatan Dharma or Hinduism, as Pavan has illuminated in the book, what do you think was the contribution of people like Dayanandji or Golwalkar, you mentioned him, what do you think, if you had to bring it down to a core, what were their contributions to the Indian tradition of thinking, which perhaps Pavan has not included?
मुझे लगता है कि अनेकता में एकता ये हमारी विशेषता है. एक्चुअली धर्म और संस्कृति इसको मिक्स करने से कंफ्यूजन क्रिएट होता है. संस्कृत में एक सुभाषित है, आकाशात पतितम तोयम यथा गच्छति सागरः सर्वदेव नमस्कारः केशवम प्रति गच्छति. हमारे यहाँ जो भगवान को मानता है वो भी हिंदू है, जो नहीं मानता है वो भी हिंदू है. तो ये कोई सांप्रदायिक और रिलीजियस सब्जेक्ट नहीं है. जो इन्होंने लिखा हुआ है वो संस्कृति, इतिहास और विरासत के आधार पर लिखा हुआ चिंतन है. तो मैं ये मानता हूँ कि वो ज़्यादा महत्वपूर्ण है. ये थिंकिंग ना जातीयवादी है, ना सांप्रदायिक है, ना धार्मिक है. ये कल्चर के साथ जुड़ा हुआ है. और इतिहास, संस्कृति और विरासत समाज की सबसे बड़ी ताकत होती है. अभी जो मैंने संस्कृत में बताया था, जो सुभाषित, उसका मराठी में अनुवाद किया था. पडे खाल तीजे नभातू न पाणी, जसे सागरा तेचे मिळवणी जाई, नमस्कार कोण्याही देवास केला, परी शेवटी तो पोचतो पेजावला. उसका अर्थ यही है कि जैसे आसमान से पानी गिरता है, कोई नदी में जाता है, कोई नाले में जाता है, और अंत को गतवा वो पानी समुद्र में मिल जाता है, वैसे हम किसी भी भगवान को नमस्कार करने से अंततः उसी भगवान को मिलता है. और विवेकानंद जी ने यही बात शिकागो में कही थी. उन्होंने ये कहा था कि मेरा धर्म श्रेष्ठ और मेरा भगवान श्रेष्ठ है. ये कहने के लिए मैंने आया. मैं ये कहने के लिए आया हूँ कि आप जिस धर्म पर विश्वास रखते हो और जिस भगवान पर विश्वास रखते हो, जो आपका अधिकार है, अंततः आप एक ही जगह पहुँचने वाले हैं. तो मुझे लगता है कि रिलीजियस, कास्ट और सांप्रदायिकता इसके बीच में ना करते हुए जो लाउड थिंकिंग है वो कल्चर, इतिहास, संस्कृति और विरासत के साथ है. और दैट स्पिरिट जो है, दैट इज़ वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट. वी नीड टू अंडरस्टैंड दैट. और भविष्य के लिए ये मुझे लगता है सबसे इंटीग्रेटेड थिंकिंग है. जो इसका भावार्थ उसमें आया है और वो लोगों तक जाएगा, तो उसमें जैसे कहा है कि विश्व का कल्याण हो, वसुदेव कुटुंबकम. तो कहीं ना कहीं भगवान गौतम बुद्ध जी ने जो संदेश दिया था, या जो बात आज हमको लगता है कि प्रासंगिक है हमारे लिए, तो आखिर विश्व का कल्याण हो तो सब दृष्टि से हो. ये बात सही है कि नो फिलोसॉफी कैन बी टॉट टू एवरीवन, विवेकानंद जी ने कहा था. पर कोई आर्थिक दृष्टि से विकास, यही कोई अल्टीमेट गोल नहीं हो सकता. आखिर आर्थिक विकास के साथ, सामाजिक विकास के साथ, जब तक फिलॉसफी के आधार पर समाज की रचना संस्कार अधिष्ठित, मूल्याधिष्ठित नहीं होगी, तब तक तो निश्चित रूप से परिणाम में निकलेंगे. इसमें से मुझे लगता है कि जो इक्वल वाली बात है वो सबसे इम्पोर्टेंट है, और वो दैट इज द स्पिरिट विच इज वेरी मच इम्पोर्टेंट फॉर द फ्यूचर, ऐसा मुझे लगता है.
So, thank you, Nitin. Pavan, you can take on all the absences in your book, but I want to add one more question to that. That just now I asked Nitinji, what he would say about what was Golwalkar and others' contributions. You've not included them in the book. And listening to his response, I thought maybe there's one distinction between people whose thinking is in response to a particular era, could be a response to colonialism or to a particular political situation. And then there's a thought process that comes up. There are others which are almost essential rivers running through in diverse ways, but which really underpins the fabric of who we are as Indians. Was that a kind of distinguishing factor why you picked people or didn't? Would love you to respond. And of course, the missingness of us, women in the book.
So it was a pleasure, first of all, to hear the elucidation of Nitinji, and always a pleasure to answer Shashi.
This is not a TV debate, Pavan.
No, we've been in college around the same time. I was 2 years a senior and debater. But this is a serious question he's asked me. First of all, I make a disclaimer in my introduction that when the canvas is so huge, when you are covering 7,000 years of thought, I will be accused by some of omitting A and including B. It's inevitable. And I then, as a justification, say that there is a process of subjectivity involved in doing so. So I accept any criticism by people who strongly believe that somebody should have been included and somebody should have been excluded. On the specific questions you raise, frankly, I think seminal ideas on politics are part of our thought heritage. If that was not the case, if I was writing a journey through Indian thought, why would I include the excerpt I have taken from the Arthashastra, which is a treatise on politics and statecraft, and which essentially, and that was my choice, speak about not the cynical statecraft for which Kautilya is known, but about the duties and obligations of a good king. Because I considered that in the times when the book was written to be a seminal thought, that there are prescribed by someone who speaks of Sam Dam Dand. He says a king should develop certain qualities by which he qualifies to be a king and can rule in a just and fair manner. And advises also on the kind of ministers like Mr. Gadkari. That king should include or exclude. So, I thought it's important.
Yeah.
It is for the same reason that from the Mahabharata, I chose the Shanti Parv. As you know, it's the 18th chapter of the Mahabharata. It's one of the longest chapters, where you have literally one of the longest tutorials on original political thought. How could I exclude it? And if I have included politics in the ancient period, I saw no reason to exclude it, some original ideas, in the modern period. So that is why politics is important. You referred to a speech of Indira Gandhi. I thought for a very long time that for someone who has been Prime Minister for 17 years or around that time, what could I include with? But if you see the speech I have included, it's not a routine speech at the United Nations. It's a summing up of India's stand on a whole range of global issues as far as foreign policy priorities were at that time. And they are part of, let me complete, this is important, that they are part of being one of the links in the evolution of our thought. Now as far as the South, This is what I was waiting to come to last. If anything, I think this book is far too biased towards the South.
Oh,
Let me give an example.
This is what will happen after delimitation, you know.
Because I don't believe in the North-South divide. I believe we are a civilizational unity.
but that's precisely why I said
And I therefore believe that there are echoes of the same power of original thought from all regions of the country. But in terms of examples, Adi Shankaracharya born in Kalari, Kerala.
So, Pavan, the extract there is your assessment of Adi Shankara from your book, rather than a direct translation of any of his bhasha.
If you have a problem with my not...
No, your knowledge is good. The original source. The original source.
Boys, I have to pull you back.
Let me answer. Adi Shankaracharya, Ramanujacharya, Madhavacharya, Nimbarkacharya, even Vallabhacharya, although born in Banaras, parents are Telugu speaking. His mother tongue is Telugu. These are among the foundational thinkers of Hindu philosophy, given entire chapters in this book from the South. Now,
Up to the Bhakti movement, no quarrel. After the Bhakti movement,
now, as far as the Bhakti movement is concerned, I consider those 600 years to be one of the most original and imaginative and creative periods of Hindu thought. I say Hindu thought because it was largely the manner in which Hinduism or the Hindu faith or Sanatana Dharma was taken out as a reaction to some of the destruction that came with the coming of Islam from the cloistered chambers of Sanskrit to the languages of the common people. Now, it is such a rich period. You say I have not included Basavanna. He is there. You say, Padiye na, it's not the
Publisher, there's no index of the book.
There is an entire
Shashi, that shows you how many look at the first page. There is an
There
index.
is an entire chapter, which is one of the longest chapters on the Bhakti movement. And the Bhakti movement,
Pavan, may I just-
because I have to answer.
Yes.
The Bhakti movement.
I want to include the audience.
Basavanna, Allama Prabhu, Antal, Nayanars, Alvars, or Alvars, and Mahadevi Akka, one of the greatest poets
Absolutely.
from the south. And you are telling me I am not included?
Guys, I'm just exercising my rights. Just give me 1 minute. Pavan, I don't...
After the Bhakti movement,
Shashi, this is a flank action attack on him because you're pulling him into Kama Sutra lists of his book, you know. So I don't want him to just list who's in, who's not. I want you to share some ideas and excite the audience about, you know, one feel oppressed by what they don't know and feel excited and curious to know more. So Nitinji, you were wanting to say something, but I also have a question to both you and Shashi. So, but you wanted to intervene.
शशि जी ने जो कुछ कहा है वो थोड़ा पवन जी के ऊपर अन्याय करने वाला है, क्योंकि जितने महापुरुषों का उल्लेख उन्होंने किया और उन्होंने किया वो इंडिपेंडेंट थॉट्स नहीं है। भारतीय विचार दर्शन के बेस के आधार पर इन सब ने काम किया, सब अपने आप में बड़े हैं। और एक किताब में जो स्पिरिट है भारतीय विचार दर्शन का, जो इतिहास संस्कृति विरासत से जुड़ा हुआ है, उस स्पिरिट को इसमें रखा गया है। ये प्रैक्टिकली पॉसिबल नहीं है कि सबके नाम डालना, सबको लिखना, पर द इम्पोर्टेंट ये है कि जो स्पिरिट उन्होंने सबका लेकर जो लिखा हुआ है वो अल्टीमेटली, इसका मतलब जिनका नाम नहीं है साउथ और नॉर्थ वगैरह, ऐसा कुछ नहीं है। ग्रेटनेस है। जात, पंथ, धर्म, भाषा और सेक्स के आधार पर न कोई आदमी बड़ा होता है न कोई छोटा होता है। ये थिंकिंग नहीं है, ये ओवरऑल भारतीय विचार दर्शन का थिंकिंग है। और जो ये इंडिपेंडेंट थिंकिंग नहीं है सबका, द बेसिक उन सब में विचारों के दर्शन का बेस तो वही है कि जो भारतीय संस्कृति के साथ, भारतीय दर्शन शास्त्र के साथ जुड़ा हुआ है। तो इसलिए उनके ऊपर ये आरोप अन्यायकारक है, ठीक नहीं है। मुझे लगता है स्पिरिट इज जो आया हुआ है सबका वो इसमें आया है.
In fact, I want to pull both of you into the spirit of the book. But Nitinji, you know, having you here, it's a very important sort of opportunity to create clarity on this thing. And I'm finding it very interesting. जो हमने प्रश्न उठाया about the Hindutva political thought, not the civilizational thought. And आपने distinction बनाया इस दोनों चीज पे, that it's not religion, it's not culture, it's a political way of thinking. So the fact that Pavanji has not included some of these thinkers, you made a very important distinction that some not original thinking which is added to the stream of Indian thought, some might be just for that time. So, and you have constantly been making this distinction about the key qualities of being Indian and Hinduism as well. तो आप कहेंगे कि इसमें एक फर्क है, हिंदुत्व थॉट एज इट इज बीइंग आर्टिकुलेटेड टुडे, इसमें कमियां है, it is not मूल्य thought, and you are very interestingly making this distinction each time I'm asking you. So as I said, it's a wonderful opportunity to hear from you, your thoughts on this matter.
देखिए, किसी भी बात को, किसी विचार को ठीक अध्ययन करने के बाद हमें पता चलता है कि वो एग्जैक्टली क्या है. एक कहता है, फिर उसमें एक कहता है, दूसरा सुनता है, दूसरा लिखता है, तीसरा सुनता है. उसमें भी गॉगल पहने हुए लोग रहते हैं, जो लाल रंग का गॉगल पहने हुए उनको लाल दिखता है, हरा लगता है उनको हरा लगता है. बेसिकली आज उस विवाद में मुझे नहीं जाना, और मुझे इतना ही कहना है कि जो वे ऑफ लाइफ, ये डेफिनेशन मैंने नहीं किया, ये भारत की सुप्रीम कोर्ट ने किया, और इसलिए धर्म का अर्थ कर्तव्य के साथ है, जो मैंने अपने बारे में कहा. और इतिहास, संस्कृति, विरासत और भारतीय विचार दर्शन, ये किसी एक थिंकिंग और एक व्यक्ति का नहीं है. बेसिक थिंकिंग में कंट्रीब्यूशन किसी एक का ज़्यादा हो सकता है, किसी का कम हो सकता है, और ओवरऑल जो थिंकिंग था, जो चिंतन था, उसमें जैसे वसुदेव कुटुंबकम, विश्व का कल्याण, ये एक्चुअली ये थिंकिंग है. विवेकानंद जी ने शिकागो में कहा है कि मैं ये नहीं कहने के लिए आया कि मेरा धर्म श्रेष्ठ है या मैं श्रेष्ठ हूँ, ये नहीं, भगवान मेरा भगवान श्रेष्ठ है, ये कहने के लिए नहीं आया. ये जो बेसिक बात है, जो हिंदुत्व, ये जातिवादी शब्द नहीं है, सांप्रदायिक शब्द नहीं है. ये कहानी ऐसी है, ये इमेज वर्सेस रियलिटी एंड ग्राउंड रिलेटिव वर्सेस परसेप्शन. दुर्भाग्यवश क्या हुआ है कि मैं किसी को दोष नहीं देता, तो लोग अपना अर्थ निकालते रहते हैं. जो हमने समझा है वो भारतीयत्व और हिंदुत्व अलग नहीं है, भारतीय संस्कृति और हिंदू संस्कृति अलग नहीं है. और हम ये भी कहते हैं कि संस्कृति सबकी एक निरंतर पुरखे जिसके हिंदू है, विराट सागर समाज अपना, हम सब इसके हिंदू. तो मुझे अंतुले साहब एक बार, मैं महाराष्ट्र के विधानमंडल में था, तो उन्होंने मुझे कहा कि तुमको पता है लेकिन हम कौन है? मुझे मालूम नहीं. बोले हम करंदीकर है, कोकणस्थ ब्राह्मण. हम कन्वर्ट हो गए बाद में. इसका मतलब ये आज भी गुजर कम्युनिटी कश्मीर में है. आप उनकी चाल चलन व्यवहार संस्कृति देखिए. खैर उस विवादों में न जाते हुए मैं इसलिए पवन जी को धन्यवाद देता हूँ कि उन्होंने जोर जो दिया है वो रिलीजियस, जात के आधार पर बाकी डिस्क्रिमिनेशन करने वाले तत्वज्ञान को नहीं दिया. जो इंटीग्रेटेड अप्रोच में जो थिंकिंग है, जो इतिहास, संस्कृति और विरासत के साथ है, और जो देश के भविष्य के लिए आवश्यक है, उसके आधार पर लिखा हुआ है. ये मैं उसको महत्वपूर्ण समझता हूँ.
मैं इस पर बहुत ध्यान से सुन रही थी, एंड आई थिंक व्हाट यू सेइंग इज वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट. बहुत सिग्निफिकेंट है जो आप कह रहे हैं, एंड आई होप दैट एवरीवन पिक्स अप ऑन व्हाट यू सेइंग कि व्हाट इज द एब्सोल्यूट फाउंडेशनल वे ऑफ थिंकिंग. It's not one way, it's not one thought, but a foundational way of thinking, approach to thinking, of identity, which Pavan has captured here. And I actually want to bring both of you to that idea. Pavan, first, I'm going to ask Shashi, but I want to come back to you. I find it fascinating that the first verse you have taken in the book from the Rig Veda, it actually perhaps encapsulates something which permeates through the book, even to the criticism of Hinduism or Brahmanism, or whether we look at Sikhism or Jainism or Buddhism. The essential first verse in the book captures that, and I would love you to share that. And then, Shashi, I'll come back to your combative nature.
No, this is what I've shared in my own book. I'm very proud of it. I think it sort of speaks to the Hinduism of incertitudes, which is so important. Yeah.
The Nasadiya Sukta, I think, is one of the most remarkable documents because the Rig Veda is the first recorded text of Hindu way of life, Hindu Dharma, whatever Hinduism, Sanatan Dharma. And I was amazed every time I read it that here is a text which begins by question, not by assertion, but by asking you to think. And so the first verse, and this is one of the few excerpts, Nitinji, where I have given the original Sanskrit and the translation. So the translation I have chosen, and there are many. So one of the verses that I start with is, the non-existent was not. The existent was not. Then the world was not, nor the firmament, nor that which is above the firmament. How could there be any investing envelope? And where? Of what could there be felicity? How could there be the deep, unfathomable water? Death was not at that period immortality. There was no indication of day or night. That one breathed of his own strength. Other than that, there was nothing else whatever. And then this is the important part. And this is what is, in a sense, the key to what I call moulik soch. The Rigveda asks, the Sukta asks, who really knows? Who in this world may declare it? Whence was this creation? Whence was it engendered? The gods were subsequent to the world's creation. The gods were subsequent to the world's creation. So who knows whence it arose? He from whom this creation arose, he may uphold it, or he may not. He may uphold it, or he may not. He who is superintendent in this highest heaven, he assuredly knows, or he knows not. Now, this is one of the first texts of and that is why I say that from the beginning, apart from what Nitinji said about Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, Ekam Sat Vipraha Bahuda Vadan. Nitin has written a lot on this. The truth is one, the wise people call it by different names. That is a good person. Am I right? Ano Bhadra Vidvo Yantu Vishvata. Let good thoughts flow to me from all directions. For me, that is Hindutva. Where is the narrowness? Where is the discrimination? Even the caste system has no sanction in our philosophy. When Adi Shankaracharya says that Brahma is in you, Brahma is in you, how can there be a social hierarchy? In his lifetime, he meets a Chandal in Kashi, and his disciples try to remove him from his path. He's a Brahmin. And the Chandal stops, and he says, you preacher, you philosopher, you say that same cosmic consciousness is in you and in me, both. Then how are you superior to me and I am your inferior? And it is said that Adi Shankaracharya composed the Manish Panchakam on the spot, of which every line said, Chandalastu so tu dvijostu, Gurureshya Manishamam. You may be a Chandal or you may be a twice born. You are my Guru. This is not what I believe. This is my resolve. Manishamam. The caste system was the creation by vested interest later. And it's one of the biggest curses that we are facing and we must reform it. And that is why I included that far more important aspect of Savarkar, which is as a social reform. I have gone through all his writing. Perhaps he has written nothing to correct me because you may know more. And Shashi, you too. You study Savarkar especially. So, you should know that he has written the most passionately on the need for reform within Sanatan Dharma.
Yes.
Periyar has written the same. Jyotirbai Phule has written the same. Mahatma Gandhi has written the same. But today, some of the great protectors of Hinduism are not thinking as passionately as Hindus that these people thought. It's unfortunate.
ये क्या होता है, कोई भी प्यूरिफाइड चीज जब होती है तो मार्केट में एडल्ट्रेशन होता है। मैं आपको लेट मी एक्सप्लेन दिस पॉइंट। प्रॉब्लम ये है कि सावरकर जी के जो सोशियो इकोनॉमिक थिंकिंग था इतना प्रोग्रेसिव था कि उसका कंपैरिजन कार्ल मार्क्स और लेनिन तक लोग करते हैं। और उन्होंने जब मंदिर में ब्राह्मणों ने कहा कि आप प्रवेश नहीं कर सकते बिल्कुल नहीं, तो उन्होंने खुद पहली बार उस समय के समय उन्होंने कहा कि नहीं, और इस प्रथा को बंद करो, जातीयता और अस्पृश्यता समाज से उखाड़ कर फेंक देना चाहिए, ये उनका थिंकिंग था। प्रॉब्लम यह है कि 5000 साल के इतिहास में जिसका इन्होंने अध्ययन किया है, जो बेसिक स्पिरिट है उसमें कुछ ऐसे लोग तैयार हुए, प्रवृत्तियां तैयार हुई कि उन्होंने धर्म के नाम पर अपनी बात को कहकर उन्हें कुछ गलत बातें डाल दी और व्यवहार में ला दी। धीरे धीरे लोगों को ऐसा लगा कि दिस इज अ पार्ट ऑफ ओरिजिनल थॉट, वो गलत था। और इसलिए जो इन्होंने लिखा है, तो मुझे बहुत धन्यवाद दूंगा इनको, इन्होंने बेसिक ओरिजिनल जो स्ट्रक्चर है, जो भारतीय इतिहास संस्कृति विरासत से रिलेटेड जो फिलोसॉफिकल स्ट्रक्चर है, जिसमें उन्होंने सबका आधार लेकर उसमें जो कॉमन चीज दिखाई है, वो सही में मुझे लगता है हमारा सही अर्थ में जो दार्शनिक चिंतन है वो है। अब ये कोई व्यक्ति आके अब ये त्रुटि कर देता है, लगे तुरंत उसको समझा जाता है कि ये इसकी रिएक्शन है, वो गलत है, वो नहीं है, वो हिंदुत्व नहीं है, वो हिंदू धर्म नहीं है। या जैसे भी कश्मीर में ये जब घटना हुई तो कितने बड़े बड़े बंद हुआ लोग है, इसका मतलब हर मुसलमान कोई आतंकवाद को चाहता है, ऐसा नहीं है। पर परसेप्शन कभी कभी ऐसा हो जाता है कि जिसके कारण लोगों के मन में कंफ्यूज होता है, और लोग ऐसा कुछ लोग समझते हैं कि जब कन्विंस करना संभव नहीं है तो कंफ्यूज करना अच्छा यही तो कंफ्यूज करने वाली बातें है। इसको 5000 साल के इतिहास में उन्होंने उसका एग्जैक्टली जो स्पिरिट है, और जिन जिन व्यक्तियों ने रखा, ये कोई इंडिपेंडेंट पर्सनल थिंकिंग नहीं है, भारतीय विचार दर्शन और दार्शनिक सिद्धांत जो है उसके आधार पर किया हुआ है। तो मुझे लगता है ये नई पीढ़ी के लिए सही समझने का तरीका है, और कोई गॉगल पहनकर समझेगा तो मुश्किल है, जो पहले तय कर देगा कि मैं ये देखना है तो इट इज डिफिकल्ट टू।
Again, Nitin ji, I don't have a media outfit, but I think the things that you're saying today are profoundly important, very, very important, because, it's about where you put a torch, what you light up as being significant. You're repeatedly emphasizing what is important about being Indian, and you're repeatedly moving away from narrow communal articulations of that. I think that's headline making, and I think it's very important, particularly at this time. It's very important what you're saying. And I think, Pavan, by excluding some things which may have had significance in their time, I think Nitinji is repeatedly saying that what is original thinking, what continues and has been like a stream through many generations and thousands of years, you have included that. And in that there are some commonalities. And I'm going to come back to you, Shashi, to pick those attributes. Whether in the very less represented South, or the 3 women who are included. I'm just joking. Pick. I think that's a wonderful message to leave. What are the few attributes that, like Nitinji is emphasizing? We've excluded some people, we've argued those out. There's a collection of people here who continuously have some common attributes even when they're criticizing each other. What are those attributes?
Well, I think first of all, and Pavan was right to start with the Nasadiya Sukta, it was precisely the unknowability of truth. The fact that you can question everything, even the omniscience of the Creator, if there is one. In fact, the translation I prefer ends with the thing, perhaps even he does not know. And that's I mean, there are different translations, and this is one that Pavan takes. But the fact is, that's one thing, questioning. In fact, the second, and Pavan and I both made this argument in our earlier books, is about samvad, argument, discussion, debate. How did Adi Shankara actually spread the message of Advaita? By debating about the debate. By going out there and saying, these are the arguments prevailing, and then taking his knowledge further. In fact, this example of the Chandala that Pavan mentioned is a famous story. And in one version of the story, he actually embraces the Chandala and says, you have understood my teaching better than my own disciples have. My disciples should not, because the Chandala begins by saying, what do you want me to move? My body or my Atma? And do we not share the same Atma? Isn't this what you taught us? Now, this is fundamental. So that's one. Of course, distortions have occurred. I love Nitin Bhai's point about adulteration in the marketplace. The caste system is a form of adulteration.
If I was like a journalist with a media outfit, I would put that wonderfully on headlines today.
and this is why the notion that ultimately caste distinctions are superficial and irrelevant to the foundational text is very well embedded. Through Pavan's earlier writings as well as in the selection here. Another important issue, I think, is the multiplicity of truth. The fact is, yes, we are all engaged in a quest for truth, but they can be different. First of all, they can be the unknowability of truth. They can also be the question of different perceptions. There's a wonderful section in Jain philosophy here. This business of what is real to me may not be real to you. And there may be something that is simultaneously real and non-real. I mean, amazingly complex ideas of philosophy being discussed 2,000 years ago, which seem very postmodern today, but they reflect these engagements with how do you grapple with understanding truth. That's another extremely important common thread. And then as you take through the strand, then there is this notion of each influence on the other. For example, when you look at the contribution of Jainism to the idea of ahimsa, that's one of the many contributions. It pops up in the 20th century in the form of Mahatma Gandhi's thinking. That's why I'm entirely in favor of including Mahatma Gandhi, because I think he was a civilizational figure as much as a political one. Now, if you look at these common threads, and you can identify very many more, they're sustained. One of the exciting things about the Bhakti movement, and by the way, my objection about the South only is post-Bhakti. Up to Bhakti, you're fine. It's after the Bhakti movement that you've got about 40 chapters.
He's got Periyar at least.
Only 3 of them are from the South. That is no problem. But my point is precisely that you have engagement, you have impact. Just as Jainism shows up with in the 20th century, Islam is very much a feature of many aspects of the Bhakti movement. And the impact of Islam can be traced very much in the Sikh Japtis as well. The notion of the Godhead is in some ways impacted by and influenced by the presence of Islam around. Sufism, and you've got Bulle Shah here, you've got others, there's a tremendous amount of engagement with other kinds of thought. So though we can proudly state that Hinduism is the world's oldest continuing civilization, as Pavan argues in his introduction, one could also argue that it's not been a static thing. It has evolved in engagement with other philosophical traditions on the subcontinent. So it's evolved. After all, Buddhism came as a reform movement against Hinduism. And how did Hinduism then absorb Buddhism? It did. It largely absorbed Jainism too. The Jains, of course, practice separately still. But nonetheless, you've got large elements of Hinduism that have taken up Jain philosophies and ideas, the same as Buddhist ideas. Sufism, Islam. Islam up to a point. So Din Ilahi was the last significant attempt to kind of create a fusion involving Islam. Islam reverted to itself and Hinduism stayed separate. But nonetheless, one can no longer be unconscious in
Ghalib, when he died, sir, there was a dispute whether he is a Shia or a Sunni, to be buried according to which types. And I think Mir and Ghalib completely blurred the importance or the need for religious distinction. Mir could write, Mir कशका खैंचा देर पे बैठा कब का तल्ख इस्लाम किया मीर के दीनों मजहब को पूछ ले क्या उनने तो Kashka is the mark of a Kashka khencha, there is temple, there पे बैठा, कब का तल्क इस्लाम किया. And Ghalib was complete Sufi who his most prominent disciple. Gupta was a Hindu and he completely transcended Hindu Muslim. So I'm saying that this see, Guru Nanak was, I have put it in the section on the Bhakti movement because that is the time it came up, but I think there is no greater religion in many ways than Sikhism when it ignores the subject Gupta. It's pure Vedantic thought. So another important thing, and just add to what Shashi, I really appreciate your summing of some of the points. So many of our texts, Nitinji, are dialogues.
Yeah. Even the
The
questioning that.
Upanishads is a dialogue. The Bhagavad Gita is a dialogue. Even the Brahma Sutra, which are the three foundational texts of Hinduism, are Brahma Sutra, Bhagavad Gita and the Upanishad. ऐसा कहते हैं. Brahma Sutra, which are one of the most brilliant parts of Hinduism, aphorisms, so abbreviated that they take your breath away. And on them commentaries are written which are thousands of pages long. And in each of those tika tippanis, there is also space given to the opponent. So that you put your point of view and then you give it opponent. And you get a complete demolition of your point of view to arrive at a synthesis. This is the tradition of Indian thought.
Thank you very, very much, all of you. I think this is a wonderful note to end on. I just want one last thought from you, Pavan, that in the book there are lots of verses, lots of philosophical, religious excerpts, not so much on science and maths and empirical thinking. I'd just love you to share literally in 1 minute why that, and would like to end on what you just said, that these are the core attributes and that's why there is a way of being Indian and these are the qualities that define it. But just the scientific thought, one quick, and then we'll stop.
There are elements of scientific thought mentioned in some other texts, but I really didn't know how to include a mathematical equation. I mean, Brahmaguru, Aryabhata. I can't put into a book on thought what is essentially the most refined aspects of mathematical or astronomical calculation. So, it's
Yeah, as I said,
not there, but it's a great achievement of the past which I mentioned in the introduction.
As I said, Pavan, we're quibbling, you've opened the door to an ocean and we're asking why haven't you opened the door to the sky, so thank you very much. This is a beautiful book. It is a primer. It brings back the correct kind of pride in who we are, how multiple that is, how essentially curious, diverse and open-minded it is. And like I said at the beginning, at a time when everyone's trying to reduce their identity, this reminds us that we have to open our identity very self-confidently. That comes out of knowledge, it comes out of curiosity. Do take his book, it's a window into who we are. Thank you very much, all three of you, for being there.
Thank you. May you come.